Hello everyone, Anna Zlatescu here and welcome to Elevate Yourself podcast. In today's episode we have Mark Metry, who is an amazing guy that has the big mission to help as many people as he can to bring as much resources on the mental health issues. So welcome, Mark.
Anna, thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
It's such a pleasure to have you and
Of
finally
course.
talk to you.
I'm excited. I'm in the first 5 podcast episodes.
Yeah, it's exciting for me too. Yeah, that's true. Cool. So let's get into the podcast and tell us more about what is your story, where are you from, and how you all started on your mission.
Wait, I'm sorry, Anna. Just cut out. And how I what? What was the last part of the question?
How you started on your path.
Yeah. So my parents are from Egypt. My family's from Egypt, and they immigrated to the United States just like a couple years before I was born. And so I was born in America, and we had a very simple childhood. My parents came to this country with not a ton of money. They didn't really know the language, and so my parents hustled a lot. They just kind of worked jobs and to make us, alive. We moved around a lot of different apartment buildings, but all in all, I had a pretty simple but good childhood, and yeah, I mean, honestly, there's so many different things that happened in my life that it's kind of hard to talk about my story, the entire thing, but I mean, basically, I was just a super shy kid. I had some physical health issues. I had some mental health issues that I didn't know at the time. And I just tried to deal with it. I played a lot of video games. I got on the internet when I was very young, which kind of began to sort of allow me to discover entrepreneurship before I even knew what that word meant. And I remember making websites and YouTube channels and apps when the iPhone came out when I was 12. And yeah, it was an interesting time. And I remember for me, probably my first big financial or entrepreneurial success was when I was 15, 16, and I started making 6 figures. And so when that happened, it actually really confused me in my life because I had achieved my definition of success of just having money to do whatever I want. And I realized that didn't really change anything because I still hated myself, and I still thought of myself as the same loser. I still didn't have any friends. And so, yeah, I mean, that was an interesting time. And by the time when I was 18 and I went off to college, I fell down a really interesting spiral in my life where I just began to party, drink, do drugs, just kind of waste my life, just watch a ton of Netflix video games, spend a lot of time with the not right people. I used to eat a lot of food. Next thing I know, I'm obese, and I get depressed. Eventually, my social anxiety, which I always had my entire life, just kind of transforms and gets more serious into social isolation, even when we're not in a quarantine. And yeah, I mean, that eventually kind of led me down a dark road where I was even suicidal at one point in my life. And then so ever since then, when I was 18, I've been on this journey for the last 4 or 5 years of just trying to grow myself, develop myself. And that's led me to meeting so many people and starting businesses and podcasts and writing books and all this different stuff. And so, yeah, it's a pretty interesting journey.
I love that. Yeah, so I think that you've mentioned your backstory and how it was for you back then, but what was that moment that made you commit to having a better life? Because I think that so many people nowadays struggle with mental health issues like anxiety and depression, and but they don't know how to get out of it. So what was your like moment that you said, okay, now I'm gonna live my best life?
Yeah. So, there were many like steps, there were many moments, there were many events where I kind of I got a glimpse or a hint of
Mhm.
that. Um, Honestly, for me though, um, I kind of had a really tough time that I was telling you about at like the very end of 2015.
Okay.
And then by like the beginning of 2016, I was still kind of facing a lot of these problems, but I was just slowly beginning to climb out of it, just slowly.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really have like any kind of revelation. I was like, I want to change my whole life around. But I think for me, it was probably discovering meditation. And I remember, I don't know if you guys have Halloween in Romania,
Yeah.
but I remember this was the day after Halloween, and I was actually hungover from
Okay.
a party that I had gone to. And then my friends and I, we had planned a trip to go to like this amusement park the day after, and we had to wake up early in the morning to go. And so I had gone to this party before, and I was hungover. And like this is a time in my life where like I was just starting to like read books, but I still wasn't really committed. So I
Mm-hmm.
was kind of like half and half.
Yeah.
Um, and so I remember like sitting in the car on our way to this amusement park. And I remember just like on my phone, just super bored because this amusement park was like an hour away. And so I definitely knew I had time. And so I just downloaded an app on my phone called Headspace
Yeah, I know about it.
Meditation. And so yeah, I mean, I just did it for like 10 minutes. And I mean, yeah, nothing like crazy happened or anything, but it was probably meditating for like 2 weeks that eventually kind of like led me to, I mean, this is a really hard thing to explain to somebody, and I talk a little bit about this in my book. But
Mm-hmm.
basically, like when you meditate, what you're essentially doing is you're just shutting off the external environment. You're
Yeah.
closing your eyes. And that's the only time where you really do that. And the reason why that's so important is because ever since we're kids, we make connections between our internal world to the outside world. So for example, of like, hey, if I'm sad, I made the connection to eat a cookie or to go eat a snack because that external pleasure will help satisfy my internal world. When in reality, that's not really the case. And so when you meditate, you begin to see these different connections that have been formed throughout your entire life between your inside world and your outside world. And so a lot of the times when we do that, we can get caught up in like creating these realities. So for
Mm-hmm.
example, like, some people have it with like, trying to find like the perfect boyfriend or girlfriend. And they built in their brain of like, I can only be happy if I'm in a relationship and I have to find like this perfect soulmate. And so when you close your eyes and you meditate for like 2, 3, 4 weeks, you basically realize that that's BS and that's not true. But if you've been trying to search for that your entire life, even if you weren't aware of this, and then you start meditating, honestly, like all of these structures of reality begin to fall down and they begin to collapse. And so that can be super scary. And so I remember there was this period of my life in like November of 2016 where I think I had been meditating for like 2, 3 weeks. I was eating healthy. I stopped drinking alcohol. I started exercising. I started sleeping well. And really like my entire body and brain were working together. And I started meditating and reading books. And it really got me to the spot of like literally all the things that I used to rely on in my life and that my ego, the story that's inside of my head, was relying on to keep me having certain thoughts and certain beliefs, was basically just like collapsing in front of my eyes. And I remember it was like super scary when it was happening. But yeah, I mean, it's like sort of a known phenomenon that happens in meditation. I forget what it's called, but it's basically like when you really begin to see how the outside world is. And I remember, they call it the meditation highlighter. So like,
Okay.
if you know, like a highlighter or a marker,
Yeah.
like on a book, like you highlight it. And so what meditation is doing is it's highlighting the stuff on the outside that needs to go, that needs to get cut off. And so all of a sudden you're living your life. Nothing has really changed except for the fact that you're meditating. And then now you're seeing all of these problems kind of smack you in the face. And those problems have always been there, but now your level of conscious awareness has increased. And so, yeah, I mean, that for me was probably like sort of a line in the sand where I began to like actually understand that I'm in control of my life and I have to take responsibility for who I am and the good things and the bad things that have happened to me, because that's the only way to control life.
Mm-hmm. I love that. It's just I actually meditated before having the podcast with you, so I was so like my mind was all over the place. So actually, I think it's the best way, and you've mentioned so well how you can just connect with yourself and take the power from within, not from the outside world. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a big thing to understand too is like a lot of people think that when they meditate, it's supposed to be all happy and peaceful. And the reality is like if you're meditating and in the moment it feels happy and peaceful, you're doing it wrong. Like that's just the reality. And so meditating is the equivalent of like going to the gym for your body. Like you're supposed to sweat, you're supposed to bleed, it's supposed to hurt. And it's like that, but it's for your brain. And
Mhm.
so, I mean, even today, like I still wake up all the time and I'm like, damn it, I don't want to meditate. I don't want to sit down for 15, 20 minutes with my own thoughts and see how crazy I am. But when you do that and you do see how crazy you are, almost in like this controlled simulation at like the beginning of the day, on the rest of your day, when you're like in the middle of a podcast or you're in the middle of a meeting or you're talking to your family and you get like those same thoughts that arise, you also just realize that that's just like part of the same like brain mind system that automatically just hits you with random thoughts that may not even be true.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess this is why it's so hard for people in the beginning to meditate, because I saw so many people starting to meditate but then just give up completely because it's
I can't clear
actually
my thoughts. That's what people
exactly.
say. It's not true. You can't clear your thoughts unless you've been meditating for like 60 years and you're like some ancient monk. There's no way, exactly. There's no way that you can clear your thoughts. Like it's just not possible. And I heard this quote once from this lady by the name of Emily Fletcher, and she says that your brain thinks the same way that your heart beats.
Okay.
Like your heart is. That's the same way our brain works, but with our
Yeah.
thoughts. And so if you understand that, then you don't necessarily have to take every thought super seriously. And it's almost like you're at a beach, you're in an ocean and you're on the shoreline, and then you just see the waves crash on the shoreline. It's just one wave after another wave, another wave, another wave. It never stops. That's the same way our thoughts work.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. But I wanted to ask you something. What does being mentally healthy means to you?
It's a great question. Yeah, so honestly, I think that we should get rid of the word mental health
Mm-hmm.
because, I mean, there's so much stigma around it. You know, there's so much misunderstanding. Like when I say mental health, what does that actually mean? You know, does that mean someone who, you know, is born with like Down syndrome, or is that somebody who, um, you know, has anxiety, or what even is anxiety? And so
Mm-hmm.
the way that I think about it is like, the same way that if you have a body, like if you're a human and you have a body and you have physical health, if you have a brain, you have mental health. And so essentially the way that I think about it is, you know, a lot of people talk about like your mindset and your mind, which is important, of course, but you know, your mind is housed in a physical organ called your brain. But yet
Mm-hmm.
nobody talks about like what's your brain set. You know, like people only talk about mindset. People don't talk about your brain set. And so I view that, you know, your brain has the capacity to be healthy and unhealthy, and that could be different for each person. And so, for example, like, um, you know, anxiety, for example, is a totally natural and normal mechanism that our brain develops to get us to do things. The same thing you could say for depression. And so the way that I think about this is I think mental health should be split in two parts. One part kind of has to do with like the truth of your life and like your purpose. And the other half has to do with your biochemistry. And so what I mean is like, you know, when I was 18 and I was depressed, I wasn't depressed randomly. The reason why I was depressed was because I was in college en route to study some random crap that I didn't even want to learn. And I knew that if I didn't do something about it now, then 10 years from now, I'm just going to be one of those people that just settled and just didn't actually live their own life because they were just afraid of what other people thought about. And so my brain was giving me signals of being depressed because it was like, hey, you know, if you think this is bad now, just wait until you're like 30 years old and you still have these problems, but they're worse. And so the way I think about these is they're kind of like, it's like on a car, it's like the left and right signal. Depression, anxiety at a very minimal level can be like that. And so a big part of it, and also like our fears, what makes us afraid, you should use them as a compass to tell you where you should go. Well, like, so for example, today I'm a public speaker. I mean, not so much now because of the whole coronavirus, but, you know, I speak all over the world. I was actually supposed to be in like Europe right now, speaking in, what country, damn it? Okay, I forget. I'll tell you later. But, you know, that's like what I do. And, I spent 10 years of my life having very extreme social anxiety and not even being able to talk to people. And so it's no coincidence that, you know, being a public speaker is what I do now, but I was running away from it for almost the 10 years of my life. And so that's one part of it. I think the other part of it, and these can contribute with each other, is your biochemistry. And so what I mean by this is, you know, Europe does a better example at this than America. But, you know, a big part of sort of our brain, like creating these thoughts that we were talking about before, a big part of that has to do with what information does your brain already have that's it's using to create those thoughts in the first place. And so if there's something wrong with your brain, it could be picking up the wrong information and it could be giving you the wrong thoughts. And so, for example, like when I was growing up and I was a kid and I experienced social anxiety, my brain would like create delusions. And so what I mean was like I would be in a classroom, for example, and, you know, my brain would look down and I'd look at my shoes and I would see like, I don't know, like a brown mud stain on my shoe. And then I would look around at other people's shoes in the classroom. And then my brain would tell me like, what, like, why are you wearing shoes like that? You look like a homeless person. People are going to think that you have no money and your family hates you and you guys just suck. And then, you know, someone at the beginning of the classroom would, maybe turn around to like talk to their friend, for example, that's behind them. And they would maybe accidentally make eye contact with me on accident. And then my brain would be like, wait, why did that person just look at me like that? Does that person hate me? Oh, they're probably talking bad about me with their friend and they probably hate me. And then now, you know, the entire class is talking about me. And so your brain will do that if your brain is like deficient in a lot of things. If it's like a weak organism, if your brain has inflammation that's surrounding it. And so like a lot of like when you begin to actually look at the science of mental health and of our biochemistry, you really do realize that a major way of how our brain functions is by different neurotransmitters firing, different brain chemicals being secreted, like serotonin and dopamine. And a lot of those have to do with many biological and environmental factors that you may not even know. And so, for example, like people that don't go outside and don't get access to sunlight are deficient in vitamin D. And I was talking yesterday to one of the world's top psychiatrists and neuroscientists, Dr. Daniel Amen, who's literally Justin Bieber's doctor, who helped Justin Bieber get out of depression. And he was telling me that in all mental health problems, the one similarity is a deficiency in vitamin D, which is mostly from sunlight and then not eating the right kinds of foods. And so when you begin to look at that, you start to see, paint a picture of like our human bodies and our brains have been created for thousands, tens of thousands of years. And we have formed feedback loops with the environment, whether that's nature, whether that's the food that we eat, whether that's how we move, that make sure we're healthy. And so if there is a certain dysfunction that is going on within sort of this biochemical feedback loop, there's a possibility that someone's brain is going to malfunction. And so, for example, another big one is like food. And like, I'll give you a crazy example. So like in the European Union, they've banned 500 different kinds of food chemicals, preservatives, chemicals from companies and manufacturers using them in food. But if you go to America, all of those same ones on the European Union banned list are in every single grocery store in America. And like in my book, like there's a study I talk about that was done in the UK that took some of like these artificial food coloring dyes, like red 6, yellow 40, blue 30. And they've showed that that can cause mental health issues with children and even cause behavioral disorders like ADHD and even eating disorders. And so this really sort of runs the gambit. And then when you take a look at like a real biochemical level, there's this neurotransmitter called serotonin. And serotonin does a lot of things in our body, from regulating our mood to our hunger, to our sleep, to our sexual desire, to regulating our functioning in social groups. And so serotonin is super, super important for mental health. And then if you look at, for example, like healthcare and the medical community, a lot of the times they give out medications that target these serotonin receptors in our brain to sort of provide solutions for people who have these problems. And then also this is talked about in like the leadership community too, like Simon Sinek talks about this all the time. And what a lot of people don't know is that most of your serotonin isn't even in your brain. Only 5-10% of serotonin is in your brain. The rest, 90-95% of serotonin in our body is in this thing called the gut microbiome, which is a vast ecosystem of trillions of bacteria, fungi, viruses that have been with us between our stomach and intestines, that whenever we eat a food, they actually process it first and then they hand it off to the rest of our body. And so like for me in my book, in the section where I talk about this, it's called First My Gut Broke and Then My Brain Broke. And I talk about the only time where I was seriously depressed in my life was when I was consuming large amounts of alcohol and processed foods and junk food. And so I think when I look at mental health in general, those are the two halves that I see. The biochemistry that I just talked about, and then sort of like the truth of your life, of like, because the reality is like, you could have perfect mental health. You could run outside every day. You could eat the best food. But if you're not living in the truth and alignment of your life, there's no way that you can be mentally at peace. And so those are the two halves that I kind of view this equation.
That's such an in-depth answer. Wow, I love that. And I think you've mentioned something like in the beginning about not knowing actually what anxiety is. And I can totally agree with you on that, because I've also had like anxiety and panic attacks and depression, and I didn't know that I have them. And I see that in so many people, especially this period of time, that like deal with panic attacks, but they don't acknowledge that. And when I tell them, you have anxiety right now, they say, no, I'm not ill.
Right.
So how should people acknowledge that they deal with mental health issues and how to approach them?
Yeah, so this is the way that I think about it. So throughout when I was a kid and I was kind of going through all this, I didn't even know what the words anxiety were. I had never heard
Yeah.
of them in my entire
Hmm.
life. And the way that I kind of think about this, Anna, is there's this analogy of two goldfish swimming in a fishbowl. And one goldfish says to the other fish, how is the temperature of the water? And the other goldfish says, wait, what's water? And so water is like this invisible substance that is clear that they can't see, but it is surrounding them at all times, morning, day, and night. And yet, let's say a fish wants to leave the fishbowl, it can't because it can't go above water. And so the water is controlling and limiting its behavior, even though it doesn't even know. And so
Okay.
that's the way that I view anxiety for someone who might have gone through it, especially when they were a kid. And what I've learned is that anything that you go through and you see all the time, eventually your mind forgets it. And it just puts it to the background of your life. It puts it to the background of your wallpaper. And I actually had a friend of mine. His name is Donald Sujo, and he's actually a world Olympian athlete. And he grew up in a communist country when he was a kid. And when I was interviewing him and chatting with him, I was like, wait, so when you were a kid, did you know that you guys didn't have food, that you were living under a dictator? And he was like, no, I had no idea what communism even was. And that's because whatever the mind is constantly surrounded by, it will purposely forget and just put it into the background. This is also why, for example, like if you talk to someone and they're like, yeah, my life story isn't interesting, or like I don't have a story, it's because we're so surrounded by our lives. We're so surrounded by, oh yeah, I did this and I did that, and it's not interesting to us because we've been inside it. And so that's the same exact way that I view whether it's anxiety or depression. And so I think that I think obviously like awareness is a big step, like just trying to have these conversations more, trying to learn about them more, trying to just gain a full picture. Like I remember when I was growing up, I definitely knew what depression was, but I just sort of envisioned it as someone who was like, sitting in the dark in their bed all day long and they don't want to talk to anybody. And depression could definitely look like that. And I've been in that position, but that's not the case. And so like if you look at anxiety, it's an inability to live in the present moment because your brain is constantly trying to predict the future, and it's trying to predict that future based on the information that it thinks it knows is right, which could be totally wrong. And so I don't know about you, but I mean, there have been so many different stories and so many different times where I've been anxious and my brain is like, no, no, don't do that, because if you do that, then this terrible thing will happen. And like those terrible things have really never happened before. And so that's what anxiety is. And then also, anxiety can happen due to you having like a nutritional deficiency in your brain. Like going back, like your brain could be inflamed because you're not going outside and you're not getting vitamin D,
Hmm.
or you're not eating the right kinds of EPA and DHA omega-3 essential fatty acids that makes your brain inflamed. And so um, what I would really say is just like, I think it's all about gaining awareness through education, and then honestly just trying to put yourself in situations. So like, for example, I didn't really know I had social anxiety until I went to like a college party. And it was only until I sort of tried to force myself to talk where I realized that I couldn't talk to people. And it was only the time where I tried to do something that would trigger my anxiety and I couldn't do it and I stopped. And, what I've learned is that every time that you do that, that reinforces pattern of anxiety because it's a reminder that says you don't have power over this. And so I think if you can start to put yourself in experiences where you begin to see this limitation for yourself and you begin to actually see how this is controlling your behavior, then that's it. And then probably the last thing that I would say too is I think it's important for each person to like reevaluate the relationship with pain. And what I mean is like, for me, like I remember every day after school, I would drive home and I would stop by like a fast food drive-through place and I would buy like a donut or like candy or something. And I would eat this candy, I would eat this donut. And sugar, for example, is the fastest form of available energy to your brain. And so if you're prone to being anxious and you're eating a ton of the sugary foods, that's actually what fuels your anxiety forward. And so what'll happen is like, you'll feel a sense of energy in your brain and that will actually cause anxiety. And then as your blood glucose level crashes, which is the way that our body processes high amounts of sugar at a biochemical level, then you get tired, you get fatigued, you might get a headache, and you'll lose energy. And so when you're going down, that could give you the feeling of being depressed.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you're depressed, then you're like, hey, how am I going to lift myself up? And then you go towards something else that may not help you. And so if you can kind of stop and look at how am I reacting to pain in my life? How am I managing struggle? What do I do when I'm confused? What do I do when I feel lonely? What do I do when I'm angry? And you begin to look at the behaviors that you do, that will often like put you on a map where you understand that your behaviors are not actually helping themselves. So for example, like, people are inside because of this whole coronavirus thing. And, you might get a thought of anxiety that says, hey, people are dying outside, the world's infected, the economy's going to collapse, this, and that. So then you open your phone and then you search this stuff on the news. And then you look at that and then the news probably gives you more anxiety. So then you get off the news, you get off your phone, you're like, I got to stop doing this. But then you're just thinking about what you just read. And then that anxiety builds on that and that and that. And then that's how you get people that are stuck inside and then they have to either, drink alcohol or vape some kind of thing or eat some kind of junk food or do whatever to get a release, to escape from their life of like this chronic pain cycle that people are in that looks different from everyone. But anxiety and depression are really just the mechanisms in which that happens. And of course, like, there are people who have like clinical depression. There are people who have clinical anxiety where they have been caught in the cycle for years and years and years and decades to where they can't really do some of these and think differently about some of these things because their brain has hardwired. And that's how you get people to be addicted to alcohol. Like I have people that listen to my podcast that tell me like, hey, I can't go to sleep without drinking alcohol to relax and calm my body. And that's just what happens when you try to deal with this stuff. And then that's how you actually create a mental illness. And so everybody has mental health. Like if you have a brain, you have mental health, you can call it brain health. But if you're doing negative behaviors for years and years and years, then that's how you get a mental illness. It looks like you don't eat, like you just eat what we call in America, the American standard diet, which is just a ton of carbohydrates and processed junk food and alcohol. It's being in toxic relationships with your family and friends. It is not addressing psychological trauma that happened early on in your life. it is constantly consuming sugar that causes insulin sensitivity, that leads to not only diabetes, but also dementia and Alzheimer's, and then mental health problems. I mean, a lot of these factors, it looks like a lot, but ultimately, the big thing to understand here is that they're totally normal. Everyone faces some degree of anxiety or depression. But if that happens for a decade and you repeat behaviors that are negative pain coping mechanisms, then like 10, 15, 20 years down the road, you're going to be like, all right, this is actually a very serious problem. I need to go, get help, which is why I'm glad personally for me that I faced a lot of these issues as a kid, because it kind of showed me this stuff early on in my life. And it made me now, being 22 years old, taking a lot of this stuff seriously and getting on that right path rather than just trying to ignore it, or rather than just trying to become an entrepreneur and trying to make money as a solution to my problems. Like, that's a major thing. And I see a lot of young people that are hustlers, that are entrepreneurs, who are trying to make money as a solution to solving their problems in life. And like, the reality is, and I've been through it, if you haven't dealt with these problems and then all of a sudden you have a ton of money and you can change your lifestyle, it makes these problems usually a lot worse, because now you have more money to spend on addictions, to spend on bad things. And the big thing with that is, like, you start getting, going back to the beginning of this conversation on meditation, you start getting external validation from people telling you, whether it's on Instagram or LinkedIn, that you're awesome and you're great, when in reality you could be ignoring and neglecting a lot of the sort of key pieces for your mental health, for your sort of inner fulfillment and validation. But because you have X amount of dollars in your bank account, nobody really cares and nobody's going to say anything to you. And so, yeah, that's the kind of way that that I kind of view it. And it's just so important. That's why I talk about what it is that I talk about, because I've made the money in my life. I've, on my podcast, I've had people who, like the co-founder of Netflix, to billionaires, that have told me that they had $250 million in their bank account and yet they were going to kill themselves. And so the reality is, like, you can be very financially successful and even help people, but you could still be very mentally poor. And so that's the message that I'm really trying to bring, because I've seen it so many times, like literally all the time. Like, I had a friend of mine who I met up with in Los Angeles and LA in last September. And this is an older guy. This is like a guy in his 40s. And, he was an author, wrote books. I'm not going to mention who, because he's actually very well known. Seems like on the outside like a pretty friendly, normal, healthy guy. But I mean, he wasn't really doing any sort of lifelong, what I call like lifelong healing habits, like things that can reprogram your nervous system, like eating healthy, like making sure you have the right neurotransmitters, like exercising, like sleeping. He wasn't really doing any of those. And today he's literally gone mentally insane, and he had to check himself into a hospital because he was literally tripping balls. And so, unfortunately, like, that's the truth of it. And a lot of people don't actually believe this stuff. And that's sad, because unfortunately it takes for like a family member to get sick and to experience this, or for themselves to see this in front of their eyes, to where they actually start taking this seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a big part of my message that I'm trying to bring forward.
Yeah, I love that. And you mentioned a lot about acknowledging and being aware of your state. But okay, so this is the first step in acknowledging that you feel the pain in different ways. And after
Yeah.
you realize that you don't have like the right behavior towards your pain, how can you take your control back and your control
Yeah.
over life? Because when you are experiencing anxiety and depression the most time, you just lose your control and this makes you feel that you don't have the control of your life. So what should people do to take their control back?
Yeah, I mean, so I think first and foremost, it's understanding that you're gonna die one day.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is, I think a lot of us can get stuck in this pattern of thinking that life is gonna be like this forever. And the reality is that's not true. Whether that comes to like you being anxious forever, that's not true. And whether it's you living your life forever, that's also not true. And so, like, when you look at people who are dying and their regrets, for example, like there's this lady by the name of Bronnie Ware, who is a palliative nurse, which is a nurse that takes care of people in the last remaining weeks of their life. And this nurse went around and she wrote down the biggest regrets of people that were dying. And the number one regret was, I wish I lived my own life and not the life that others wished of me. And so when you begin to understand that, you really do begin to realize that you could, like, literally tomorrow you could die. And the reality is like, did you really do what you wanted to do? Because I think a lot of us, whether it's we're kids or later on, we all have dreams. We all have things that we want to do. And a lot of times, whether it's depression or anxiety, these things can come and almost sort of possess us as almost like clouds that tell us nothing is ever going to be better, or you're a loser and you suck. And so I think the biggest thing to understand is like the real thing that we should really be not afraid of, but the real thing that we should be at least concerned of is our own death. Because a lot of us live like we're living, like we're going to live like this forever. And that's just not the truth. And so I think if you can account for your own death and almost kind of view it as life's biggest inspiration of like, hey, if I know I'm going to die today, does it really matter, the opinions of what my family thinks about me or my friends think about me, because I really want to do this thing, but I have so many people's opinions in my head and it's not letting me. So I think that's number one. And then number two, the biggest one is like, so many people that ask me this question, they're like, I have no motivation to do better, or I have no whatever. And that is literally because people are constantly in the cycle of pleasuring themselves with vices. And so the real thing that I've learned is like, when I look at my life and I kind of look at my timeline, I ask myself, why didn't I become who I actually am early on in my life? And it's because I didn't let myself feel the real pain of my existence. Because whenever, like going back to the beginning of the conversation of looking at your pain, whenever I would feel a moment of anxiety or depression or pain, I would instantly run towards something that would give me a sense of pleasure, whether that was food, whether that was people, whether that was alcohol, whether that was sex, whether that was whatever. And so if you are able to like look at, again, your relationship with pain, and you can cut out all your vices for a day, for a week, you're going to have a state of mind that you've never had access to. And like the big thing with this is like, it doesn't just have to be drugs. It can be anything to where you escape from, to escape your daily responsibilities of life. This could be you, scrolling through social media. This could be you gossiping and criticizing about other people as a projection about how you really feel about yourself. And so look at the vices that you're using. Look at the things that you use to escape and cut those out for as long as you can. And oftentimes if you do that, oh man, you're going to get hit with a lot of pain. You're going to know exactly who you are, and it's going to suck. And like I look back today at my rock bottom when I was depressed and I was suicidal, and where I was in the most amount of pain in my life because I cut out my vices. And yeah, it was horrible. It was through an insane amount of pain. But eventually it's through that pain that you actually find your purpose for being alive. And so that's like the biggest thing that I can tell people. So many of us are just trying to escape from pain and just jump into these temporary sources of pleasure that we think are going to make us happy, when in reality, happiness is overrated. Happiness is nothing. Happiness is a temporary fleeting state of mind that you can get from drinking a cup of coffee or drinking alcohol. Like, that's what it is. The real name of the game is fulfillment. It's having a life-term sort of contentness. And like, the reality is like, you have to go through pain. I go through pain all the time, all day. And that's what growth really is. And so yeah, that's probably the biggest thing that I would say is like, get clear on like the truth of your life, on like your death. Realize that life is very, very temporary, and realize that, you know, if you don't do these things that you've always wanted to do, you might not get another shot. Because I mean, I don't know, you could get infected by COVID, you could die, you could, you know, when I walk out of this house after this podcast, I could get hit by a car. And like, if I wasn't doing the things that I would now, I would die with so many regrets. And that's probably the most painful thing, you know, looking at something and not being able to change it. That's the most painful thing, at least in my head. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, totally. And I love how you said that turning your pain into your purpose is kind of the key. And I think that you're the perfect example that turned a disadvantage into an opportunity and build his whole personal brand and life around that. So yeah, I think it's cool for all the listeners to see how they can turn their pain into their purpose.
Yeah, and I think so much of, like, I honestly, like, I'm in the whole self-improvement industry and entrepreneurship industry. Honestly, I think half of it is just complete crap. I think people, like, again, like, there's obviously, there's levels, and not everyone is at the same spot in their life. But for someone who's looking for like a real transformation, that's not going to happen by people telling you, just be positive, just be happy, just be grateful. Like, yeah, those are great things for like maybe myself now at the stage that I'm at, but like, that's not going to do anything for you. And like, the reality is like, so many people are hearing these messages from people who are well-intentioned. And the reality is it's not bringing them closer to their real primal pain, which is where they can find their purpose for life. And so that's like the biggest message I'll tell people, like, find out the truth of your life. Stop listening to bullcrap from people. Stop consuming bullcrap in your vices, and like, literally get into a real primal pain full position to where you're not lying to yourself anymore. That's really it.
Yeah, that's so true. And I have a last question for you,
Okay.
regarding like the context we're living right now, which is coronavirus. And it's like easy to say just have a positive mindset and develop yourself when you like have access to more opportunities. But when you're staying home and when you don't have much freedom like it's in Romania right now, it's so easy to just go into mental health and depression and anxiety. So how should people deal with that right now so they don't get into that very bad state of
Yeah.
mental
So what I
health?
would do is, so I'm in America, we can go outside, we can walk around. In Romania, and I assume other parts of Europe, you can't even do that.
Yeah.
And so what I would say is, literally open your window and stick your head out for 20, I'm being dead serious, literally for like 20 minutes, 30 minutes, like literally listen to music, literally just stick your head out if you can, remove your windowsill. It doesn't work if you just stand in front of a window. It's not the way that your body gets sunlight. So like, literally, if you can't go outside, I would literally stick my head out of the window for 30 minutes. I'm being dead serious. Listen to music, listen to a podcast, do something. Talk to people down below. I don't know, do something, play an instrument, but literally stick your head out, because, I find for me, like, we're always going to be in pain throughout our lives. But I find that if you can check the box on your biochemistry, on like the biochemical things that I was talking about, you can be in a much better position. Because like, people, you could talk about like, oh my God, like, what's my life? What's my purpose? But the reality is you've just been eating ice cream and cookies all day, and your brain is in this anxiety, depression cycle. And so number one is just check the box off biochemistry. Like, make sure you're sleeping well, make sure you're doing in-home exercises, make sure you're eating healthy. stick your head out the window. That's like step one. And then honestly, step two is, I don't know about you, but I've really been using this time to actually be more calm and to almost be in silence, because I've realized that, when you're busy and you're hustling all the time, a lot of times what happens is you don't actually process your emotions. And what happens is when you stop working or you stop hustling or you stop traveling, and it's just kind of you yourself in the corner of your house, all these sort of emotions can start to come up and process. And so with that, there's going to be a lot of good and a lot of bad. I've definitely had my bad days throughout this quarantine as well. But I think for me, the number one thing that I'm realizing is I'm trying to view myself as almost like a science project of like, why am I getting this feeling that I'm like this? And a lot of us can almost just believe that feeling in terms of like, for example, like, feeling that, like, for example, I feel super lonely, even though I'm quarantined with my family and they're awesome people and I love to talk to them. But I think back and like, when you go beneath the emotion, I think back of like, I'm lonely because the environment that I'm in now of like living at home with my parents and my family, that has been an environment that I haven't really been in for a while now. And it was an environment that I grew up in when I was a kid, and I was super socially anxious. And so I'm getting these feelings of loneliness, one, because I can't really see my friends. Number two is because my brain is going back to certain environments. Because if you go back to certain environments, there's an imprint that's left in your brain that never really goes away. And so if you can view your emotions as like, don't just believe them right away of like, oh, I guess I'm just lonely. But like, ask yourself why. Try to see if there's like an indicator as to why you're lonely. And it might mean that you're just not doing things. So for example, like yesterday I felt lonely, and it was because, I didn't really schedule enough FaceTimes and Zooms with like my friends that I want to talk to. Mm-hmm. And so I think if you're able to use your emotions as a messenger and be like, why is this happening? What is this trying to tell me? Then that's it. Like another one is for example, like, maybe up until about like 6 months ago, my relationship life was in a terrible scenario. And I would get on these apps, like these dating apps, like Tinder and like Match, and I would scroll through them. And I would get matches and I would message, and I would be through like this whole stupid cycle of trying to basically receive validation from other people that I didn't know. And every time I would do it, I would honestly get depressed, because it would remind me of the feeling of the times where I got rejected and I felt lonely by like some girl that I had tried to ask out when I was early on in my life. And so when you can kind of look at these things, it's very easy to be like, I hate dating apps, or I hate social media. When in reality, those could actually be signs or a reminder that are trying to tell you something bigger. And so that's like a major part of the way that I view it too. So, so that's what I would say.
Love that. And thank you so much for coming to the show and for all the conversation. And I think so many people are going to benefit from it, and hopefully they will try to cope better with mental health that it's so real right now. So thank you so much.
I hope so.